Lesson 8G, Synapse or Synaptic Transmission. The simplest sensory motor response is called the reflex response, which involves a minimum of 3 neurons, a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron. The continuation of an action potential from one neuron to the next is called synapse. This occurs at the interface where an axon foot, also known as the terminus or the end plate, of one neuron meets the dendrites of the next neuron in the chain. As the action potential arrives at the axon foot of the first neuron, which is called the presynaptic ending or presynaptic membrane, the impulse must somehow travel across the gap between the two neurons to the dendrite of the next neuron. This bridging of the gap is necessary or the nerve impulse stops, and the impulse may not arrive at the central nervous system for processing and interpretation, or the impulse may not make it to the effector tissue, organ, or muscle. The action potential that arrives at the end of the axon will cause a special calcium ion channel to open in the presynaptic membrane. The calcium will stimulate contractile proteins in the presynaptic neuron, and this will move synaptic vesicles carrying special chemicals called neurotransmitters to be exositized and released into the gap. We call this gap the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitter will diffuse across the synaptic cleft to the postsynaptic membrane of the next neuron, where it will bind to the receptor proteins on the membrane of the next neuron. The binding of this neurotransmitter will cause sodium channels to open up. If enough channels open, then threshold will be reached and an action potential will be generated. If there is not enough sodium channels opened, possibly due to insufficient neurotransmitter, then an impulse is not created. This process of neurotransmitters being released by the presynaptic membrane and binding to the postsynaptic membrane is called synapse, and is also an example of an all or none generation of an action potential. After some time, the neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft will be degraded by enzymes, which prevents the action potential from being generated over and over and over again. This is followed by a refractory period, where the presynaptic membrane cannot release neurotransmitters for a little while. Synaptic transmissions only occur in one direction, as only the presynaptic membrane carries neurotransmitters, and only the postsynaptic membrane has the neurotransmitter receptors. This example of neurotransmitter opening sodium channels to create an action potential is called an excitatory synapse. Some neurotransmitters that are excitatory are acetylcholine, glutamate, and aspartate. Alternatively, the neurotransmitter that arrives at the postsynaptic membrane could cause chlorine channels to open and cause hyperpolarization of the postsynaptic membrane. This will effectively make it more difficult for an action potential to occur in the next neuron. We call this type of synapse an inhibitory synapse. Examples of this type of inhibitory neurotransmitter are glycine or gamma-aminobutyric acid, also known as GABA.
Action potentials arriving at the presynaptic terminal cause voltage-gated calcium ion channels to open. Calcium ions diffuse into the cell and cause synaptic vesicles to release acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter molecule. Acetylcholine molecules diffuse from the presynaptic terminal across the synaptic cleft and bind to their receptor sites on the ligand-gated sodium ion channels. This causes the ligand-gated sodium ion channels to open, and sodium ions diffuse into the cell, making the membrane potential more positive. If the membrane potential reaches threshold level, an action potential will be produced.